I can't believe it. PlayStation 4 is almost 12 years old now, even though it feels like they just announced it yesterday. Test stands in stores, lines stretching to the registers with the lucky people who managed to snag one at launch. Time flies incredibly fast, but what's even more surprising it's that despite the PS5 being available now for many gamers, PlayStation 4 is still the best console, not just of the 8th generation, but in gaming history period. And there are actually some legit reasons for that. Here's the paradox though. Few people realize that all this massive success was built on failure. The disastrous launch of PlayStation 3 laid the foundation for the fourth one's triumph. Sounds wild, but it's true. And today, I'm going to tell you the incredible story of PlayStation 4, how Sony learned from past mistakes, how the console was developed, what challenges the company faced, and how PS4 ultimately became the absolute leader of the 8th console generation. So get comfortable. This is going to be interesting. To understand the success of the fourth PlayStation, we gotta first remember what was happening with its predecessor. PS3 was generally not a bad console, but it came out after the phenomenally successful PS2, which Sony wanted to not just repeat, but multiply. As I already covered in a separate video, they decided to make a new unique cell processor for PlayStation 3, which on paper was insanely overpowered, from high performance to low power consumption, which would allow it to be used in consoles, TVs, and other devices. They even created supercomputers with it to calculate black holes. But first of all, developing a new processor is expensive, and those costs obviously translate to a higher price. And second, it affected developers who literally had to learn a new architecture and port their games to it. Because of this, at launch, games not only looked worse than on Xbox 360, but sometimes didn't come out at all because developers didn't want to port them. Plus, the console cost $100 or even $200 more than competitors, depending on which configuration you got. So when creating PS3, Sony literally turned away from gamers and developers in favor of some kind of progress, even if it was questionable. Meanwhile, Microsoft, on the contrary, even at the cost of huge financial losses, didn't fall flat on their face, selling not only the console at a loss, but also replacing every broken Xbox 360 under warranty. Because of this, only by the end of the generation could PS3 catch up in sales and slightly overtake Xbox 360. But nevertheless, Microsoft's success is undeniable. That's what makes it so paradoxical how everything changed in the next generation. Development of PlayStation 4 started almost immediately after the failed PS3 launch. While one team was trying to put out the fires of the current generation, another one already in 2008, just 2 years after PS3's release, began working on the next one, naturally taking all the nuances into account. So the cell processor and any proprietary chip development went straight to the trash, and instead they took an already finished solution. They chose AMD as their partner, a pretty logical decision since AMD offered both processors on the x86-64 architecture and their own graphics chips. This allowed them to create a unified system on chip where both CPU and GPU were on the same die, which in 2008 wasn't such a common solution, especially in consoles. On one hand, this sped up data exchange and consequently performance. On the other hand, it made production cheaper. And it allowed Sony to even splurge on 8 gigs of GDDR5 RAM without significantly increasing the console's price. Which is especially important in the console wars, since Xbox One only had DDR3 memory installed, way slower than PS4. But the console itself cost $100 more than Sony's. And the main thing the AMD partnership gave them was a familiar architecture, like on a regular PC, which simplified porting multi-platform games. If before developers needed months to learn Cell, now ports were done in weeks. Many studios could get their PC games running on PS4 literally in a few days, and then just focused on optimization and adapting to the console's specifics. But there was still a problem. There were few games at launch, especially in times without backward compatibility. So to avoid launching with an empty game lineup, developers are sent dev kits in advance so they can optimize their games for the not yet released console. In the previous generation, this was also a mess, so with PlayStation 4, they decided to do things differently. Parallel to console development, they started creating dev kits for developers. Sony learned from PlayStation 3, where the first dev kits were not only expensive, since not everyone gets them free from the company, some had to buy them, but they were also slow and ultimately very different from the final hardware, since adding a separate graphics chip to PlayStation 3 was something Sony decided only at the very end of development, because of the difficulty working with Cell. But with PS4, first of all, the hardware was already agreed upon from the start. And second, the first dev kits appeared at major studios already in 2011, 2 years before the console was announced. They were big black boxes packed with debugging equipment with various extra buttons not found in regular versions, no region lock, but with performance already matching the final console version. What's funny is these dev kits are still pretty sought after by collectors even now, though playing on them without modding unfortunately won't work. But hardware is one thing, controls are another thing. They paid special attention to working with the new gamepad, even though the controller itself wasn't sent to developers at launch, so nothing would leak. But to better understand how to use the touchpad, light bar, and built-in speaker, Sony created special demo applications that emulated each controller element's capabilities. Speaking of which, instead of investing in proprietary hardware, Sony decided to invest in their own gamepad. Since DualShock 3 from PS3 was, to put it mildly, uncomfortable. Small grips, awkward triggers and bumpers, and the sticks looked like mushrooms with stiff clicking. So gamers had to suffer a bit, but in return we got one of the best controllers in history. DualShock 4 fixed all these issues. The analog sticks got a concave shape with a textured surface. Holding them became way more comfortable, and clicking easy. They redesigned the triggers. Now they resembled real weapon triggers. Added tactile feedback, vibration became more precise and varied. And most importantly, the ergonomics became comfortable. True, Sony felt that just fixing the previous gamepad's flaws wasn't enough, and they decided to add lots of new stuff. From a touchpad that only internal studios used, well, or third-party ones at best assigned opening the map or another action to it, to an LED that was initially intended for camera tracking of the gamepad, but ultimately found unusual application in games. For example, in Grand Theft Auto 5 it flashed red and blue during police chases. In The Last of Us, it dimly glowed like Joel's flashlight, and in Alien Isolation, the bar reacted to the xenomorph's presence, creating additional tension. Plus, they also added a speaker for some sound effects, a headphone jack, and most importantly, Sony understood that gamers love sharing their achievements, and made it super simple by adding a share button. One press, and you can take a screenshot or start recording video. Another press, and the content's already uploading to social networks or YouTube. Basically, Sony clearly learned lessons from PlayStation 3's failed launch, which they positioned as something descended from the heavens, like a reward from Sony for spending money on it. And they made a console that rewards you, making both the architecture simpler for developers and cheaper for buyers, plus a comfortable gamepad offering unusual features and emotions. And all this was presented to the public in February 2013, but interestingly without the console design itself. Like with PlayStation 5, Mark Cerny went on for over an hour about PS4's technical features, why they chose an AMD processor, how important GDDR5 memory specifically is, and how all this would work now. Deadly boring for regular gamers, but here's the thing. This presentation was more for developers to rehabilitate themselves after the previous generation by showing that on the new one, they could easily release their games. Well, they scheduled the presentation for gamers at E3 that same year, importantly after the Xbox One reveal, where the green guys either believed in themselves too much after Xbox 360 or deliberately sabotaged the new console, since the person responsible for its development hastily retreated from the company a few months before the presentation. That's not the point though. Microsoft themselves pushed gamers away, which Sony was quick to take advantage of. At the presentation, besides announcing games, Jack Tretton, then president of Sony Computer Entertainment America, came on stage and methodically tore apart Microsoft's decisions, or more simply, trolled them.
PlayStation 4 supports disc-based games without internet connection,
which was a direct response to Xbox One's requirement to always be online. Plus, Xbox also wanted to register each disc to a separate account, which eliminated the ability to resell them, or rather, made it extremely difficult, and Sony mocked this too.
PlayStation 4 doesn't impose restrictions on selling used games.
And in the finale, it was enough to announce a price $100 cheaper than Xbox to make the hall explode with applause.
At $399.
Microsoft really made critical mistakes with Xbox One. The console was positioned as a universal multimedia device, not a gaming platform. Huge attention was given to television, streaming services, voice control through Kinect, which came mandatory in the bundle, which is what added $100 to the cost.
Xbox, watch TV, TV remote, TV experience.
And the always online policy became the main problem. Xbox One required an internet connection every 24 hours to check licenses. Without internet, the console literally turned into a brick. Remember, this is all in 2013, when not everyone even had internet, let alone stable internet. And I'm not even going to mention modems with data limits. Basically, if in the previous generation Sony ignored gamers and got a logical response, this time Microsoft stepped on the same rake. Sony just had to carefully watch their competitors' mistakes and methodically avoid them. PlayStation 4 was also initially made as a multimedia platform where you could watch movies and play games. Don't forget that PS2 was partly bought for DVD viewing and PS3 for Blu-ray, which was generally normal for that era, and PS4 was made with emphasis on Netflix, YouTube, various streaming services and stuff. But the reaction to Xbox One forced them to reconsider priorities. Gamers made it clear they need a gaming console, not a media center, and Sony quickly adjusted their marketing, focusing on games and the gaming experience. Of course, Xbox could also do games, and at the start it even had more exclusives coming out than PlayStation. But while Microsoft was explaining Xbox One's complex ecosystem, why Kinect was mandatory in the bundle for an extra $100 and stuff, Sony just showed beautiful games and a nice price. The message was super simple and clear. PlayStation 4 is the best console for games, and those who need streaming and YouTube on their TV will just buy themselves a TV box. And surprisingly enough, it worked. The E3 presentation went viral. Clips of key moments got millions of views in hours. Especially popular was the meme with instructions for sharing games on PS4. Sony released a short video where one person simply hands a disc to another. This was a direct roast of Xbox One's complex DRM system. So in many ways, we should say thanks to Microsoft's strange management too, who even if not intentionally, helped their competitors. Pre-orders went at record pace. Amazon reported that PlayStation 4 became the most pre-ordered console in the company's history. GameStop, Best Buy, and other retailers reported the same thing, and this is just US data. Microsoft, of course, tried to fix the situation. In June 2013, the company canceled most of the controversial decisions, removed Always Online, allowed selling used games, even made Kinect optional, though initially they claimed the console simply wouldn't work without it. But it was too late. Xbox One's reputation was damaged, and PlayStation 4 had already seized the initiative. True, Sony skillfully maintained the hype until release. They regularly showed new games, talked about the console's capabilities, communicated with the community, importantly, while simultaneously trolling Xbox, which by November 2013 allowed PlayStation 4 to become the most anticipated console of the generation. And so November 15th, 2013 became a historic day for Sony. On this day, PlayStation 4 went on sale in North America. The console cost $399, exactly what they promised at E3. Lines in stores resembled iPhone releases. Gamers stood for hours to become owners of the new console. And in major cities, stores opened at midnight, and by that time hundreds of people gathered at the entrances. And 2 weeks later, the console's release reached the rest of the world. And it was a grand success, especially against the backdrop of the previous generation's failure. PS4's success exceeded even Sony's most optimistic forecasts. The company planned to sell 5 million consoles by the end of the fiscal year, and they sold the first million in just the first 24 hours after launch, and remember, not worldwide, which caused shortages at launch, not like with PS5 because of semiconductors, but still not pleasant. Especially when scalpers resold consoles on eBay for $600 or $800. But these are minor details. Globally, it was a success. Sony managed to rehabilitate itself in gamers' eyes. True, Xbox wasn't exactly an outsider either. By the end of November, after the European launch, PS4's sales figure grew to 2.1 million consoles. Microsoft reported selling 2 million Xbox Ones in the first 18 days, but this figure included more regions and with a more failed presentation, all because PlayStation initially had nothing. Even though Xbox's policy was quite self-destructive, by release, having seen a sea of hate, they abandoned many controversial decisions. Meanwhile, after PlayStation 4's launch, gamers discovered that online became paid, which for example wasn't the case on PS3. There were also few games, mostly multi-platform, and only one game at release from Sony itself. This was Killzone Shadowfall, which failed so spectacularly that Sony still hasn't returned to this franchise. Though visually the game wasn't bad, but that's all. Pure benchmark in the guise of a game to show the new generation's capabilities. Yeah, later, many solid games came out. But at the start with shortages, scalpers charging $800, paid online and no games. Even without backward compatibility, many were looking toward Xbox, which still hadn't given up on exclusives back then, even time ones from third-party studios. Though it also had no backward compatibility, but only at first. Over time, they brought it back, and it became one of Xbox's key features. Meanwhile, PS4 has no backward compatibility with PS3 to this day, same with PS5. Which is already strange considering even a fan emulator on PC exists. Well, whatever. Time passed, and by March 2014, Sony reported selling 6 million PS4s. The plan was not just met, but exceeded. Their console led in almost all regions except Britain, where Xbox was traditionally stronger. The success was backed not only by sales numbers, but also user activity. PlayStation Network showed record connection numbers. Digital game sales grew month to month. The PlayStation Plus service, which gave access to free games, gained millions of subscribers, which also became a kind of revolution of the 8th generation. Developers were also happy. The simplicity of porting from PC led to absolutely all games coming out on PS4, even low-budget indies, and gamers enjoyed top-tier graphics that beat Xbox because of better hardware, and this at a lower price. Basically, by the end of 2014, it became completely clear PlayStation 4 won the console war of the 8th generation before it really even began. Xbox, of course, wasn't going to give up so easily either, and with Phil Spencer's arrival, they brought back backward compatibility, started hastily developing what's called an intermediate generation under the codename Project Scorpio, aka Xbox One X, and even a slim version that became more powerful than the base Xbox One S, though it cost less itself. And most importantly, the company was already working on a unique solution for the gaming industry, the Xbox Game Pass subscription, which they presented on June 1st, 2017, and it would have been a sensation if a year earlier Sony hadn't held their most explosive presentation in history. In 2016, at the E3 presentation, Sony prepared a real bomb that erased all competitors and the negativity around their console, which was starting to accumulate both because of previously unresolved issues and new ones. For example, the cancellation of the anticipated horror PT from Hideo Kojima. Its demo was even playable. Sony's technically hard to link to this, but the aftertaste remained anyway since this was an anticipated exclusive reboot of Silent Hill. Well, E3 crossed that out too. Not only did they show Death Stranding from that same Kojima exclusively for PS4, but also many new games. God of War reboot, Days Gone, Detroit Become Human, New Horizons Zero Dawn gameplay, and Resident Evil 7, which on PS4 was also coming out with an exclusive VR gameplay function, because PSVR was also shown for the first time at this presentation. This alone was enough to make people drool over PlayStation 4, but Sony felt that wasn't enough, and just a couple months later they held a special presentation where they showed both new PlayStation 4 Slim and PS4 Pro consoles. And while everyone basically expected the Slim version anyway, considering previous generations where releasing a thinner console with the same hardware at a lower price was the norm, well, at least until the current generation with PS5, nobody expected Pro. There had just never been anything like this before. Not only was this a more powerful console marketed as a device for 4K gaming, even if not native, nevertheless, the console cost the same as base PS4 at launch, but with more modern hardware and better visuals. And this was the kill shot to Xbox One, the X version of which they only released a year later. Of course, gotta give big respect to Microsoft, who didn't give up and abandon their baby against such a competitor, and continued polishing Xbox One so they could ask for a rematch in the next generation. But competing with PlayStation in the 8th generation, they no longer could. And most importantly, it's probably not even the console's power. We in the previous generation proved that clearly. A video about it is also coming soon, by the way, so subscribe so you don't miss it. Here it's all about the content exclusively. Even though at launch PS4 couldn't boast a gorgeous game lineup, it actively developed it. At the start, as already mentioned, only Killzone Shadowfall came out with gorgeous graphics but derivative gameplay and story. But then came infamous Second Son, which was beautiful, interesting, though short. And Knack became a meme because of its simplicity, which gave Xbox an advantage at the start, especially when gamers saw that the first The Last of Us that came out on PS3 was still unavailable on PS4. It would only come out a year later with better graphics and certainly become a system seller. But PlayStation 4 owners spent a whole year watching those who weren't planning to change from the previous generation playing The Last of Us, with obvious confusion at Sony. But the main bombardment of gorgeous exclusives began in 2015 with The Order 1886, a gorgeous alternative version of Victorian London with its Knights of the Round Table fighting vampires, which impresses with its graphics even now. And even though PS4 couldn't pull the game at full resolution back then, which is why they added those annoying bars, nevertheless, the game found its audience, and it's a real shame it didn't get a sequel. That same year, the exemplary Bloodborne came out, which is still a PlayStation exclusive to this day, and one of the best Souls-likes, combining dark atmosphere, combat with both melee and firearms, with high dynamics, dodges, and weapon transformation. And I still don't understand why Sony and From Software can't make a second part. After all, Bloodborne introduced many to the Souls-like genre and earned one of the highest scores on Metacritic. And then in 2016 came Uncharted 4: A Thief's End, an exciting adventure from Naughty Dog, showing some of the best chases in video game history, and generally how seamlessly cutscenes dynamic moments with engaging routine change. Also this year came Ratchet & Clank, a decent arcade game without pretension to anything lofty. And nevertheless, each year something unique came out from Sony itself. In 2017, we finally got to try Horizon Zero Dawn, which alone made many buy the console. Yeah, it wasn't perfect, primitive stealth, already annoying towers, but with a unique world, intriguing story, and non-trivial combat, which made you immerse yourself in this world story until the very end. And then Gran Turismo Sport also came out for speed enthusiasts, and Neo, which had been in development since 2004 if I'm not mistaken. And in 2018, God of War came out, a reimagining of one of Sony's oldest franchises. And not being afraid of such an experiment, they made a masterpiece without exaggeration. Brutal, dynamic, touching in places, and with tons of subtext. With memorable characters, an interesting setting, rich atmosphere of Norse mythology. Basically, I can sing this game's praises for a very long time. And it's such a shame that current Sony has given up on new IPs, is afraid of experiments with old ones, and just makes sterile sequels. It's not that it's bad. What's bad is that besides them, there's nothing new. That same year, Detroit Become Human also came out, after which even I fell in love with cinematic games. Thanks to the tension, liveliness of the story, its variability, and characters you empathize with. And of course, this year another game came out that made many run to buy PlayStation 4, Marvel's Spider-Man. This was Sony's apex when they raised the bar so high they still can't repeat it, being essentially hostages of their past successes, which will come back to haunt them in the future. In 2019, Death Stranding came out from genius Kojima, against which Concrete Genie, a bright and quite original game focused on creativity, went almost unnoticed. And Days Gone, which in my opinion is a gorgeous adventure in the admittedly tired zombie apocalypse, but which tried to stand out from others. At least with bike riding mechanics, with horde mechanics, destroying which is a separate art. But against the backdrop of last year's God of War and Spider-Man, the numbers weren't so impressive, which is probably why we'll never see a sequel. And in 2020, The Last of Us 2 came out, which of course has many questions. But this is exactly the game they say won't leave anyone indifferent. You can love it, you can hate it, but it'll definitely evoke emotions. And Ghost of Tsushima, which came out before the new generation and became the last major new release, not only on PS4 but also PS5. At the end of 2020, the new PS5 also came out, which was impossible to find anywhere at launch, because of which PS4 lived even longer. But repeating the same success didn't work out. There were few unique games and sequels that were announced as next-gen exclusives. For example, God of War Ragnarok or Horizon Forbidden West came out on PS4 too, even if with worse graphics, but who cares? Now Sony isn't exactly spoiling us with new releases, only putting out sequels to successful past releases, or just burying millions of dollars in failed live services like Conquered. And nevertheless, PS5 is still loved. But partly all this was provided by the 8th generation success with the legendary PlayStation 4. Which by the way is still relevant to this day, and I'm not talking about games coming out for it. Quite the opposite, each year there are fewer and fewer releases, even among the indie segment, but about modding which gave the legendary console a second life. What's funny is the first Jailbreak appeared just a year after the console's release, but it was what you'd call a crutch. The idea was that due to a vulnerability, the ability appeared to copy games from one console to another, and clever hackers would buy some number of games on one console, then simply transfer them to other consoles, and sell these sort of bundles with their markup. But if you finish these games, you could either have these same hackers load new games, For this, you had to drag the console to them, which in Brazil, where this hack appeared, might have worked. Well, in other countries, you had to update the console and all these games were successfully deleted. Not much of a hack, but the beginning was laid. And then at various hacker conferences, turns out there were such things, different methods were demonstrated for loading Linux and various retro emulators. Was this a hack? Technically yes, but playing Sony exclusives with it was impossible. Plus, Sony hustled, and after the previous generation software hack, which was pretty easy, decided to add game binding to firmware updates. So, if the old firmware was hacked, you still couldn't play new games. And for a long time, this actually worked, since firmwares were hacked very slowly, sometimes with a year lag from the current one, and during this time, some exclusives already leaked to PC. So rather than wait, hackers just started patching games so they'd run on old operating systems, and for a long time this worked. But now practically all consoles are hacked. Even if you have a new firmware version, it can be downgraded to a hackable one. It's not exactly simple to do, but those who need it will figure it out. And it's needed not just for free games. Modding gives practically unlimited freedom, from returning deleted games like that same PT for those nostalgic for old times, to installing custom mods like Fallout London, which only exists on PC, well, or on PS4 through modding. Same goes for fan dubs of many games, especially relevant now. Improved textures, access to installing plugins or retro emulators. So modding is essentially unlocking the console's capabilities to 100%, well, only without online in games. Though this too can be implemented by returning to official firmware if the console didn't catch a ban, which allows even now for PlayStation 4 to be relevant and an interesting little console for many. Especially considering the huge library of games released over the whole generation. In the end, PlayStation 4 became the console that defined the face of the gaming industry for an entire decade. Its influence went far beyond simple technical specs or impressive sales figures. PS4 changed attitudes toward console exclusives. If before, exclusives were often the result of financial agreements, Sony bet on their own studios. Horizon Zero Dawn, God of War, The Last of Us. These games became possible only thanks to long-term investments in talented teams. Technically, PS4 proved the viability of APU solutions from AMD. Integration of CPU and GPU on one chip became the standard for consoles. Xbox, Nintendo Switch, even Steam Deck all use a similar approach. Plus, PS4 Pro showed that an intermediate generation can be successful. The idea of a more powerful console within a generation seemed questionable, but Pro found its audience. This paved the way for Xbox One X and future Pro versions of consoles. But the transition from PlayStation 4 to PlayStation 5 turned out not as smooth as Sony would have liked. The company stepped on the same rake as in previous generations, and what's especially funny, the two console giants switched roles again. But we'll talk about that in a few years when it's time to draw conclusions about the 9th generation too. And PlayStation 4 will remain in history as one of the most influential consoles of all time. Its sales exceeded 117 million units, making it the second best-selling PlayStation console after PS2. But numbers aren't the main thing. PS4 showed that console gaming can be accessible, diverse, and innovative at the same time. PlayStation 4 was a console of its time. It appeared at the right moment with the right decisions at an adequate price. Such a combination of factors happens rarely, and Sony managed to use it as effectively as possible. The story of PlayStation is a story about how triumphs are born from failures. Sony turned the PS3 crisis into PS4 success.